Hello, this is Barb Eglinton. I'm currently the Executive Board President at UUCF. I was asked by the Lifelong Learning Committee to present the history of UUCF at a Lifelong Learning Forum in 2010. I first learned about this history when Gwen Foss shared her manuscript of the book that she's been working on for more than a decade. Gwen is an extremely talented writer and historian. I'm terribly impressed with the research and writing she's done. The material for this presentation is almost exclusively from Gwen's work. My husband and I are working with Gwen to get the book to print. Gwen was able to compile information about our beginnings because of a few priceless individuals who made an effort to preserve our history. And those individuals are Ida Steele, Mary Shaw Green, Reverend Elizabeth Etz, Chet Downing, Perry Jameson, Art and Pat Morrill, and Gwen herself. I am incredibly grateful to these folks for preserving our rich history. Okay, let's start at the very beginning with our founder. Our founder is a man named Sergius P. Lyon. He was born in western New York in 1805. He was born into a Calvinist household. At the age of 32, he and his wife Lucinda moved west, arriving in Farmington in 1837. Sergius was not a minister. He was skilled in many trades. He was an architect, a house builder, a carpenter, a watchmaker, a stove manufacturer, and an undertaker. He left quite a legacy in Farmington. Houses that he built still stand today, and his funeral home, which is currently the Heaney Sunquist and is still located north of Grand River on Farmington Road, and in fact it has a plaque indicating that it has been in continuous operation since 1850 when Sergius founded it, when he opened it. Sometime in early 1838, less than a year after arriving in Michigan, Lyon began acquiring preachers to expound the gospel of universal salvation in Farmington. Universalism was one of the largest religious denominations in the United States at the time. Universalists found no mention of eternal punishment in the scriptures and preached that because all men and women were children of God, God would not abandon any person to hell forever. Many Christians came to Universalism through their own study of scriptures and found inspiration in passages such as, "The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are on all his works," and from Psalms, and "God desires all men to be saved," from Timothy. Michigan already had a number of Universalist societies, in the earliest one having been formed in Bloomfield Township, probably the site of BUC today. It was formed in 1829, followed quickly by one in Pontiac in 1830. In the 1830s, societies were springing up in many nearby villages. There was a society in Plymouth and a fledgling society in Waterford Township. Reverend Edward Mott Woolley was a very important minister in our history. Born in 1803 in New York, Woolley was brought up in the Presbyterian faith and fully embraced its partialist teachings. Not Universalist, because partialists believed that only part of the human race would make it to heaven. As a young man, he became a devout member of the local Presbyterian congregation, where he took great satisfaction in proclaiming his Calvinism to the world. He was a fierce debater of the Calvinist teachings, but eventually he was won over to the Universalist view when he could no longer support his Calvinist partialist teachings. So over the next 2 years, Woolley preached in Farmington as often as he could. In 1849, he had established a regular circuit that included not only Farmington, Birmingham, Pontiac, and Waterford, but also a society in Livonia. And I think so this is a picture of a circuit rider, not necessarily Reverend Woolley, but probably indicative of the time. In early days, of many small frontier towns, union churches or union societies were a common name for a shared meeting house. Citizens would pool their funds and construct a single meeting house, often called a union house, to be used by two or more denominations in cooperation with each other. The members of the union society would work out a detailed schedule laying out how much time each would be allocated to occupy the house. There was just such a house in Livonia at the time when, I guess in the 1830s. And Farmington Universalists had close ties to the folks that used the Union Society house in Livonia, and because it was a short 4-mile distance from Farmington. This Union house in Farmington was built in 1851 at the corner of 5 Mile and Farmington Road. I don't think there's any evidence of that in that location anymore. Since Willie divided his time between many congregations, he was not heard in Farmington every Sunday. When he did preach, though, he would deliver 3 sermons on a given Sunday, and his listeners stayed to hear them all. Sabbath day worship was an all-day event, and we get cranky when Alex speaks for over 60 minutes. Again, this is not Willie speaking, but an example of a circuit preacher. In Farmington, the Union Society was rather atypical. The meeting house that was eventually constructed there was almost entirely owned by Universalists. Only 3 families were not Universalists that shared in the venture to build our meeting house. Lyon sought to offer a privilege to other Christians of whatever creed to worship side by side. His objective, as he put it, was to extend to others a courtesy which had been denied of ourselves. Even though nearly all the Union Society members were Universalists, members of other denominations were always welcome. In the spring of 1853, Lyon purchased a plot just under an acre at the northeast corner of Thomas Street and Warner Avenue, just 1 block east of his house and funeral parlor, the present site of the parking lot of the Methodist Church across from the farmers' market. The cost of the land was $200. Nearly 4 years of careful planning and fundraising and general encouragement led to the construction of what may be called the most handsome house of worship that Farmington has ever seen. The building was positioned sideways in relation to Warner Avenue. The plain, humble structure was aligned so that the entrance was in the south and the pulpit was in the north. Each of the long sides of the building had 4 rectangular windows of plain glass, allowing plenty of sunshine in and providing for spacious views out. There was no ostentatious stained glass for this congregation. Apart from a small rectangular tower and spire that rose about 35 feet from the ground, the house was without ornamentation. Lyon's signature style permeated the structure. Every aspect of the handsome new meeting house was aesthetically proportioned. The ratio of 3 to 4 was evident in the footprint and in the dimensions of the gable end. Even the small tower and spire were the perfect size to complement the building. Every detail marked the new house of worship as part of the fashionable Greek revival movement. From the simple rectangular floor plan to the elegant, low-sloping roof, from the short returns under the eaves to the wide, unadorned fascia boards. The entrance was placed on the gable end according to the custom of the time. This early church truly embodied the openness that it espoused. Phoebe Sherman Ross, born in 1854, a daughter of Farmington pioneers, remembered Indian Chief Whitehorn, who, hearing her family at prayer services, asked if his people might join. And again, this is not a picture of Chief Whitehorn, but is an example of a Native American family at the time. An invitation was heartily extended, and so it was that folks came, regardless of creed or color. Chief Whitehorn and his people were welcome and attended services at the Union Society. As the end of the decade approached, Lyon's vision of an open, welcoming church for people of all faiths was put to a severe test. Controversy erupted over the use of the meeting house by spiritualists. The congregation was divided. It was a crisis that, if not resolved well, could have sunk the society permanently. In 1859, The spiritualist movement was a nationwide phenomenon focusing on seances and other forms of attempted communication with souls in the spirit world. Universalists were generally receptive to this new religion. Some Universalists participated in seances, and a few preachers, like the Reverend J.P. Averill of Michigan, resigned from the Universalist ministry to preach spiritualism. In Farmington, a number of members of the Union Society were interested in this new religion and supported the use of the meeting house by its members, but Lyon was strongly opposed to the idea. The reason for Lyon's opposition is not known, but some people believe the leaders of this new movement to be charlatans who faked the appearance of spirits in order to take advantage of families grieving for their lost loved ones. Others did not consider spiritualists to be Christians and saw spiritualism as something other than a religion. For whatever reason, Lyon had custody of the church keys and refused to allow the spiritualists to hold a meeting in the meeting house. The trustees at the time overruled Lyon and agreed to open the meeting house to spiritualists over his objections. With the majority of trustees against him, Lyon finally relented under the pressure and unlocked the doors. For the next several years, the Union Society shared its building with the spiritualists, who continued to hold meetings and seances within its walls. The spiritualists gave lectures and often held 2-day meetings with speakers coming from many parts of the country. Spiritualism remained active in Farmington for about 2 more decades, but faded away well before the turn of the century. Anti-slavery was present in Farmington in the years before emancipation. The Quakers organized the greatest anti-slavery activity, and the Grand River Trail was one route in the Underground Railroad. See it's route number 5 on this map. Chauncey W. Green, a trustee of the Union Society, was known to have been a part of the secret system. Remember that name, Chauncey W. Green. He'll come up again in about 1872. Eloquent former slave and women's rights activist Sojourner Truth was invited to speak at Farmington, and one of the observers wrote, "When she rose to speak, her commanding figure and dignified manner hushed every trifler to silence." Born into enslavement in New York State, she gained her freedom in New York when slavery was abolished in 1827. Leaving her slave name behind, she named herself Sojourner Truth and became a traveling preacher, telling people about her relationship with God whenever an audience could be found. Her preaching often included personal testimony of what it was like to live under slavery. In 1860, at the age of 35, the very well-known and popular circuit rider was engaged as the 5th pastor of the Farmington Union Society, Reverend Chauncey Washington Knickerbocker. From the moment Knickerbocker delivered his first sermon in Farmington, the interest and activity in the Union Society began to increase. Under his leadership, the Union Society had regular services for the next 10 years. In 1866, the members of the Union Society joined with Sergius P. Lyon in creating the first Universalist church of Farmington. Prior to that, they had been a society, not a church. But they developed a declaration of faith that was inspired by the Winchester Confession of Faith, developed in 1803 by the General Convention of Universalists, which was the national organization of Universalists, and had served as the grounds for many newly formed Universalist churches. Though it was, in some sense, a unit of the Union Society, the newly formed church differed in many ways. So at this time, the society stayed intact and there was a church, and they coexisted for a period of time. The new church organization was founded upon a written covenant, and so was much more religious in its grounding and purpose. Worship services would now include some of the ritualistic sacraments. The elected officers would now include 2 deacons, whose duty was to assist the minister in the celebration of communion, a sacrament which had not been observed before by the Union Society. The latter part of the 19th century saw a general decline in Universalism in America. The decline of the Universalist presence in Farmington was probably caused in some measure by the death of Sergius P. Lyon in 1878. The church relied heavily on his leadership and began to flounder without his guidance. For many of these years, the church had no settled minister and limped along with only the occasional service held for a handful of dedicated members. The church may have failed completely during this period if it were not for the untiring support that it received from its core members. It's also possible that the church's survival in 1872 was aided by the occurrence of a major disaster in Farmington. During the early morning hours of October 9th, 1872, a fire broke out about 2 blocks from the meeting house. It started at the center of the village near the intersection of Grand River and Farmington Roads, and the flames spread quickly from building to building, traveling north and east toward the church. It's likely that if the building caught fire, it would have been consumed rapidly. However, the church and much of the town was spared from the flames of the quick thinking of Society member Chauncey W. Green. Do you recognize that name? When Green heard the alarm, he mounted his horse and galloped to the scene of the emergency. Bucket brigades were already in action, but were insufficient to halt the spreading fire. Green shouted to the volunteers to demolish a house in the path of the flames, and by this action the fire was brought under control. The Universalist meeting house was untouched. Where do you remember the name Chauncey W. Green? Remember, he was a member of the Underground Railroad. Okay, even this dramatic rescue only gave a brief respite from the decline of the church. Less than a year later, in April of 1873, the trustees formed a committee to ascertain why so many members of the church were absent from the quarterly meeting. At the next quarterly meeting, the church was having difficulty raising the funds necessary to pay the assessment to the Michigan Convention. A committee of 2 was appointed to solicit $1 from each member to raise the needed funds, and they were successful. It was in 1870 that the church welcomed its first woman preacher, the Reverend Lucia Fidelia Gillette, who went by Fidelia, as an occasional guest to its pulpit. She was the daughter of Edward M. Woolley, Farmington's beloved minister from 1850. Gillette soon became a well-known preacher in Michigan and throughout the Midwest. Later in her career, she was noted as the first ordained woman settled in the Ontario parish. Fidelia was born in Nelson, New York on April 8, 1827. She was the oldest of the large Woolley family. By the age of 14, her poetry had appeared in the New York Tribune, published by Horace Greeley, who was not only a nationally known and very well-spoken curmudgeon, but a Universalist himself. Farmington's little white church was on the brink of ruin, but there were still a few who refused to see it die without a fight. The Ladies' Union may be given a large measure of credit for rescuing the church from complete failure in the latter 19th and early 20th century. The purposes of the existence of the Ladies' Union were many: to raise money for the church and for charitable Universalist causes, to organize receptions and parish dinners, to serve as an avenue for social interaction of its members, to provide educational experiences for those who attended meetings, and to plan and carry out projects for the betterment of the church and community. Membership in the Ladies' Union was open to all women in the community, regardless of religious affiliation, and in this way, it was something like the women's version of the Union Society. Ida Steele was an active member of the society. She grew up in the Farmington Church and was also an active member in the Union Society, or the Ladies' Union. She assigned herself the responsibility of securing guest preachers whenever the opportunity presented itself, a duty that she would carry on throughout the rest of her life. Ida is the second woman from the right here, with the plume on her hat. Here's another picture of Ida by herself and with a young girl, which is probably a niece because I don't believe that she had any children. Without question, one of Ida's best resources was the Church of Our Father, Detroit's largest Universalist congregation and one of the nation's largest Universal congregations at the time. The congregation built a Gothic sanctuary at Casson Forest in 1916, and when Detroit's Unitarian congregation sold its building on Woodward in 1934, the Universalists allowed them to share their building, and the church still exists on the same site today. At many times during this difficult period, the trustees of the society considered selling the meeting house because the drafty old building was badly in need of repair. The plan always ran into trouble due to difficulty in establishing ownership of the property. Having a regular minister always led to an increase in membership, but for much of this era the congregation was so small and struggling that no minister could be persuaded to stay for more than 1 or 2 years. A somewhat steady succession of guest ministers arranged by Ida Steele and the Ladies' Union helped to keep the doors open. Every preacher visiting the Farmington pulpit during these years was either settled at the Detroit church or was a guest preacher serving the Detroit church. An amazing turn of fortune helped to keep the church alive in the early 1900s. On May 20th, 1911, in the village of Wixom, an elderly woman passed away, leaving almost all of her property to the Universalist Church of Farmington, and granting the remaining small portion to her niece. In doing so, she completely cut off her brother and nephew. These slighted relatives, Albert Bowen and Ford Birch, contested the will on grounds of undue influence. The Betsy Longnecker will case, was to engage the attention of the community, the church trustees, and the state convention for the next 2 years. Betsy E. Longnecker was a native of Vermont, but was a resident of Milford Township in the 1890s. It's not known why she left her estate to the church, but it's possible that she was attached to the Universalist Church in New Hudson, which had long since ceased to be, or to another defunct congregation, and rather than leave her money to her relatives, she bequeathed it to the nearest Universalist church. According to the Farmington Enterprise, her will stipulated that after her funeral expenses were paid and a Universalist minister had been paid for officiating the funeral, the remainder of her property should go to the Universalist Church Society of Farmington. The income must be used for the repairing of the church and paying for the preacher's salary. In 1813, the local newspaper reported that all parties had agreed to the discontinuance of the case, so it was settled. Few references to the fund exist about the amount of her bequest, but in 1951, the remaining principal in the fund was reported to be over $5,000. So the church reaped financial benefits from this fund for over 30 years. With this windfall of money, the trustees set about to make needed improvements to the building. A major project in 1914 was clearing the property of a number of privately owned sheds used to house carriages on Sunday mornings. The sheds were considered an eyesore, and the trustees ordered each shed owner to haul it away. Over the next years, expenses for painting, installing new eaves and window panes, putting in sewer connections, and new hydrants and pipe, and other improvements were recorded. There was some evidence that a restroom with a sink and toilet was added to the vestibule. This looks like our current buildings and grounds to-do list. Along with these efforts, a further improvement project was initiated by the Ladies' Union, transforming the church grounds into a small but attractive park. The enterprise noted that the park would contain beautiful trees and pretty shrubbery with walks for the convenience of people. This improvement will be a handsome addition to the village, adding comfort as well as beauty. Ground was broken in early December, and within a week a number of new shrubs and small trees were in place. The city agreed to maintain the grounds as a city park. Further physical improvements came over the next 2 years. The church building was electrified in 1916, and the park was enhanced with the addition of silver maple trees. A small fence was added along the north and east sides of the church, probably to prevent foot traffic from damaging the shrubs in the park. For the first time in a long time, there was even a little money in the bank. But World events were soon to intrude on Farmington. In July of 1914, the clashes between Serbia and Austria marked the beginning of World War I. By October, the war had spread over most of Europe. Funds for relief work were raised in all the churches in Farmington and sent to the American Red Cross. In response to the war, the Farmington Relief Association was organized by 30 businessmen under the leadership of Frank Steele, Ida's brother. At the same time, every church fraternity, civic group, and social organization in the township was called on to appoint its own vice president and organize itself as a member of the Red Cross. The Ladies' Union lost no time in refocusing their efforts and sewing supplies for the Red Cross. Additional sewing circles were created in every neighborhood. Addie Pearson organized a Fairview neighborhood circle with Pearl Gibson. Over the next year, the Ladies' Union made countless socks, pillows, rugs, quilts for the benefit of soldiers and refugees. For 40 years, from 1880 to 1920, the church had seen more years without a settled minister than with one. Only two things kept it going: the income from the Longnecker bequest and the loyalty of a few elderly members whose ancestors had built the congregation from scratch. It's fitting to pause here and look at one of the mainstays of the congregation. Carlos and Ella Steele were pioneers who had settled the organization since the Union Society was created. Clara and Ida Steele, two daughters, Clara and Ida, were active members of the Universalist congregation. Two other sisters, Hattie Steele Everett, and Zeta Steele, were also active, as were brothers Frank and, to a lesser degree, Cloyes. Clara's husband, Perry Wixom, also became a devoted church member. I want to thank Lisa Keeler Fitzgerald. She's the great-granddaughter of Raymond Steele, who really was not associated with the Universalist Society, it seems, from any records that I have found. But she has traced her heritage and has shared these photographs with me. The Wixom family was also extremely helpful in the early days of our church. Frank and his wife Bertha built a homestead on 11 Mile near Drake, and that home is still today. If you drive down 11 Mile, you can see this. It's on the north side, just east of Drake Road. With the help of the Steeles and the Wixoms and a few other devoted members, the Universalist Church of Farmington limped along during another long, lean period. Over the 30 years from 1920 to 1950, the church had only 5 years' worth of preaching from a settled minister, and even that small amount was divided between two pastors. The bereft congregation continued to gain small benefits from the closeness of the Detroit congregation, and would also be helped by the last few members of the Universalist Church of Plymouth. In 1920, the Reverend Anthony Beresford was installed at age 54. He was already one of the denomination's most prestigious ministers. He was a quiet, scholarly man. His move to Farmington was facilitated in part by the Michigan Convention because it had agreed to pay $300 of the $1,000 salary that Reverend Beresford would earn at Farmington. The denomination on a whole was experiencing a minor upswing at this time. Money was coming in from Boston headquarters, from all across the country, from donations toward other churches to help churches that were struggling. In January of 1921, Beresford began the first of many acclaimed lecture series. I think that he would be proud to hear about our LLF lecture series. His were also on Thursday nights. Another prominent feature of Beresford's era at the church was a frequent banquet with Toastmasters with a plethora of speakers. Publicity for these events called members and non-members alike to a feast of reason and a flow of soul. Soon after the Reverend Beresford arrived, a new construction project was underway, a parsonage for the Farmington's Universalist minister. The nearby Methodist minister's house was called the parsonage, so to avoid confusion, the Universalist minister's house became known as the manse. The church's prospects looked far better in 1921 than they had in previous years. Sunday services and nightly lectures continued, interspersed with occasional special celebration. Farmington's devoted minister, though nearly blind, continued to give noteworthy sermons, lectures, and public speeches. The tiny congregation struggled to bring in new members to ensure itself a future. The annual meeting of 1924, it was noted that the congregation was unable to continue to pay Reverend Beresford's salary. So, left with no settled minister, the church members were again challenged with the task of somehow filling the pulpit in order to keep the church going. Ida Steele again assigned herself the responsibility of securing guest pastors as frequently as possible. She quickly made friends with the minister of the Universalist Church in Detroit, who was pleased to help. Reverend Frank Adams began appearing about once a month in Farmington. His Sundays were occupied by his duties in Detroit, but he often came out to the small rural community on a Wednesday evening to preach to a devoted handful of Farmingtonians. This monthly arrangement continued even when Adams accepted a call to the pulpit of Unity Temple in Oak Park, a posh suburb of Chicago, and moved there with his wife Helen. During the year 1925, Dr. Adams delivered a total of 14 sermons in Farmington. His preaching was sparse, but at least it was regular, and apart from one volunteer pastor who filled the pulpit for a season, it was just about the only preaching the tiny congregation was to have for the next 25 years. Helen Follett Adams took a back seat to her younger husband. Helping and supporting Frank through his career, she came into her own during World War I. While the couple were in Urbana, Illinois, Frank had occupied the pulpit since 1916, but from 1917 to 1918, he was overseas serving as a first lieutenant in the infantry. The congregation called on Helen to fill her husband's pulpit for 18 months while he was away in the Army. After she gave a year of excellent work, the Urbana congregation ordained Helen Adams on April 14, 1918. Helen gained the nickname of the War Minister for her services. When Reverend Adams preached in Farmington, he always opened with these words: "Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God." When the Great Depression struck the country, farm foreclosures in Farmington began to skyrocket. By December of 1933, the Farmington Enterprise, regularly having only about 8 pages, had been forced to add 6 more pages just to list the foreclosures. The nation was undergoing the worst economic depression it had ever known. Social issues occupied the attention of many church members who organized projects separate from the church to address them. One such organization was the Economics Discussion Group, which began attracting Universalists and non-Universalists alike. Church members Rufus and May Crossman started this weekly discussion group in their home on Grand River Avenue. Those most often in attendance were Harley and Ethel Gibson, seen here in an old photograph. Alan Nelson, Helen Hard, and Frank Steele also were regular attendees of this group. Remember the Ethel and Harley Gibson, they'll come up again later. The church underwent 2 upheavals in leadership during 1933. The first concerned the loss of its longtime president, Elliot Sprague. I haven't said much about Elliot up to now, but he was a neighbor of the Steeles, and he served as moderator or president from 1909 to 1933. He passed away unexpectedly on April 27th in 1933 due to complications from a broken collarbone after having been thrown from his horse. He was 86 years old. Isn't that amazing? He died by being thrown from his horse at the age of 86. Incredible. Sprague had served as president of the congregation for 25 years. Without a strong leader at the helm, the church again faced the danger of collapsing entirely. Ida Steele came to the rescue once again, suggesting a radical solution that actually turned out to work. She urged the appointment of Archie G. Leonard, who was not a member of the church, but she had been friends with him and encouraged him to take over the leadership. They had worked together at the Farmington Bible School, which was organized in 1924 at the Methodist Church, but included all Farmington denominations. In January of 1928, Ida had welcomed Leonard into her home while his wife and 3 children were quarantined in the Leonard house due to scarlet fever. Strong ties of friendship had been laid, no doubt, and influenced Steele's ability to encourage Leonard to serve as president for 1 year. This was a brilliant stopgap measure, which prevented the church from sinking deeper toward failure. The second leadership upheaval in 1933 was concerned Reverend Dr. Adams. But before we go there, I just want to say that Frank Steele took over leadership of president from 1934 to 1949 for 14 years. And our current term for president is 1 year with a 1-year renewal. So these folks served quite a long time, which is pretty admirable. So anyway, Dr. Adams' presence in Farmington was reaching its lowest point. He appeared on 3 occasions in 1933 and only twice during the following year. In 1934, after a successful term from Archie Leonard as president, Frank Steele, seen here with his niece Margaret, was elected president and continued 14 years, as I have mentioned. The church had again survived through many years of winter and was ready to spring forward with new life and growth for the future. Plans to remodel the meeting house were brought up in 1945. The chief obstacle, as usual, was a lack of funds. The ambitious fundraising effort led by Helen Adams brought in the needed funds, and the project was off the ground by 1947. The first step was the rotation of the meeting house 90 degrees around on its central axis. On the morning of October 11th, the church was moved partly around and excavation started for the basement. By November of 1947, the building was on its new foundation and work was progressing in order to get it in shape to have services again. During this phase of the project, services were held in the town hall. The new basement represented a significant improvement to the old meeting house. With new lighting and heating installed above and restrooms below, the church now had its own social hall and no longer needed to rearrange the pews or rent a hall for social events. Soon, special plans were drawn up, another fund drive was initiated, and a kitchen was added to Adams Hall. Francis Smith brought a motion to the annual meeting on November 13, 1949, that the new social hall be named Adams Hall in honor of Reverend Dr. Adams. The elderly minister, who had been out of the pulpit several weeks convalescing from a serious illness, had faithfully served the congregation since 1925. Though he was nearly blind, he was still a captivating and forceful preacher. On April 18, 1950, Dr. Adams celebrated his 75th birthday in the new social hall. A special birthday dinner was held, and the room was officially christened Adams Hall. In order to whip up encouragement from memberships and to hint that a grand 100-year anniversary event was coming, a slogan was adopted for the project: "Work like a bee for 53." A banner with this pronouncement was made up and hung over the doorway of the meeting house. Remodeling the exterior of the meeting house exterior of the meeting house was the next phase of beautification project. The architect's plans called for extending the front roof 10 feet to create an overhang over the porch and adding 4 square pillars as roof supports. The new concrete walk, steps, and platform were to be laid in front of the building, significantly improving the appearance. And here is the result. Very nice. This is a picture from the 100-year anniversary celebration on October 4th in 1953. And here is a picture of Archie Leonard, Bertha Steele, and Frank Steele. In 1953, this was also the year that the Universalist Church began to have a relationship with the Unitarian denomination. The church engaged its first Unitarian minister, Russell Lincoln, in 1953. He served Farmington half-time and was also half-time at the fledgling Birmingham Unitarian Church in Bloomfield Township. Though he was 38, when he came to Farmington, he is remembered as a youthful minister who built up the church's youth group immediately. Soon after his arrival in Farmington, he organized a chapter local of the Liberal Religious Youth, or LRY, a national youth group created and populated by young people of Unitarian and Universalist churches. The local LRY comprised Universalist youth from Farmington and Unitarian youth from Birmingham. Another new tradition that was started in the 50s was the art show. Church member Harley Gibson, a painter and a pianist, as well as a farmer, organized large art shows with a lecture, an exhibition, and an auction. A great deal of the paintings were donated by church members, notably Harley Gibson himself and Wanda Pusey, as well as others. Reverend Walter Kellison was installed as the new minister in 1956. During Kellison's tenure, more of the old traditions of Universalism fell away. While he was a Christian, not a humanist, the national denomination was moving closer to humanism during this time. The Farmington congregation was starting to move there as well. Kellison was regarded as an excellent administrator, a friendly and compassionate man, but not the inspiring preacher the church had had in Dr. Adams. One of Kellison's lasting contributions to the Farmington church was the inauguration of the church magnet, the church newsletter, the magnet. And here was one of the early editions of the magnet, which is still in existence today. Memories differ as to when the service auction began, but it is a church tradition that stretches back to at least Kellison's time and continues each year. This picture is probably not from a service auction, but it's about the same period of time. It's probably a breakfast or something in Adams Hall. The last vestiges of the old Universalism were now fading away. By the early 1960s, with the calling of their first atheist minister, Farmington's Universalist had moved farther away from the original theological roots than the founding members could have imagined. Reverend Robert Eddy was a radical change from the pastors of the previous 100 years. He was the embodiment of the new view that God is dead, carrying on his commitment to peace from his previous positions with the American Friends Service Committee, or Quakers. Eddy participated in public rallies against the Vietnam War. His controversial sermons on sexual issues drew harsh criticism from local conservatives. His outspoken support of atheist clergy garnered condemnation from local ministers and columnists. Eddy was also the first minister to encourage members to address him by his first name, Bob. An atmosphere of informality spread through the congregation. And when Reverend Eddy was the minister, he also had a radio show that aired locally. Harley Gibson was the third generation to live on the family farm on the western tier of Farmington Township. In 1953, the property was declared a centennial farm, having been in the hands of the same family for 100 years. So here's Pearl Gibson, and here's Harley with that poofy hair, and Ethel, his wife. And this is Pearl's husband. I don't know his name. But here is Ethel and Harley in their later years, and here they are as newly as a young couple. But Harley Gibson remembers his earliest times in the church at a pageant in 1905 when he sat a front pew along with his grandmother, and Reverend Lee McAllister was the minister at the time, and he was known to frequently say that Universalism was knocking down the walls between the creeds. But Harley could never have guessed how important him and his future wife would be to the survival of the church. In the early days of the Gibson farm, the main concerns were dairy cows, beef cattle, hogs, and sheep. Wheat was produced to feed the animals, and timber and firewood were collected and sold. Over the years, the cattle gave way to more crops. Potatoes, peaches, raspberries were produced in quantity, and the southern portion of the farm was turned into an orchard producing steel red apples, named for the Steele family. Here's an aerial photo of the area at the time. Harley inherited the family farm in 1956 on the death of his mother, Pearl. By then, the farm had shrunk to about 52 acres. The northern part of the original quarter section had to be sold, or was sold, to George and Alice Peacock in 1938. The Peacocks had built a home on their new 108-acre plot for privacy had planted countless spruce trees around the buildings. The area soon became nicknamed as the Pines, and you can see the spruce trees here on the northern end of this pond, which is now the site of the golf course, the community golf course that's here. And the church had already been moved by then, because you can see it here. But this was the property of the Gibson farm, and this was the apple orchard, I think, down here south of where the church stands now. Okay, back in downtown Farmington, the little UU church was struggling for parking for all the worshipers who came to the center of Farmington on a Sunday morning. There were two possible solutions: tear down the meeting house and build a new one somewhere else, or move the ancient building to a new location. No vote was taken because the conclusion was obvious. No one wanted to entertain even the slightest possibility of tearing down the beloved old meeting house. It was to be saved at whatever cost. When the Gibsons announced that they were planning to retire and leave some of their land to the church, it was obvious what to do. Move the meeting house to the center of Farmington, from the center of Farmington to the outskirts of Farmington Township. It took 3 years to plan and accomplish the move of the old Universalist meeting house, a short 2-mile walk down the road. Everyone associated with the church contributed to the project in some manner. 5 families made significant contributions, and one of those families was the Morrills. Another was obviously the Gibsons, and Barb Windsor's family as well. In the early summer of 1965, a squad of volunteers armed with sledgehammers, crowbars, and other implements of destruction began the arduous task of dismantling and removing the tower. It was no simple job. It took many blows to loose even a small piece. Barb Windsor, part of the crowbar team, was also in charge of going to the police station every Saturday morning and getting a license to burn the rubbish for the day. Demolition continued for many weeks. She and other volunteers spent every Saturday whacking off pieces of the steeple and tossing them down to the ground. A bonfire was lit at the end of each day, and pieces were burned as they were removed. Nothing of the tower remains today except a partial beam and a small metal ornament from the tip of the steeple, which was saved for posterity by Mary Gentry. On the coldest day of the year, January 18, 1967, the 113-year-old Universalist Meeting House was moved from its original site in the heart of downtown Farmington to its new home, the Gibson Centennial Farm on Halstead Road, where we are today. It literally took hours for the church to move the first 2 blocks. It went south on Warner Avenue, 1 block to Grand River, then turned west and went 1 block to Farmington Road. As it navigated its major intersection to turn south onto Farmington Road, it stopped traffic in all directions. They intentionally moved it on the coldest day of the year because that's when the roads would be able to support the weight with all the frozen ground underneath. The glorious day of the move was over, but there was still much work to be done to get the building ready for services. The new addition was soon christened the Gibson Wing in honor of the generosity of Ethel and Harley Gibson, without whom the church would not have had the money or the land in which to move. In drawing up plans for the new wing, the architect deliberately gave it a lower roof line than the meeting house, thus symbolically elevating the meeting house. It was constructed with a flat roof in order to emphasize this line, but unfortunately this roof was an engineering failure and had to be replaced with a standard peaked roof a few years later. And this peaked roof was put on entirely by volunteers. A member by the name of Don Oswald was the chief architect of the overseer of the project to put on the peaked roof. He was also a master electrician and did a lot of the electricity in the Gibson Wing. The 60s and 70s were fun times at UUCF. Many parties were hosted in the social hall. This looks like a casino night. And this gentleman with the beard is our Honorable George Rourke. This is a very lovely shirt from the 70s. The caller looks like he's calling out the numbers of bingo or something. And notice the kitchen is back here where our storage room, where we store our chairs. That was where the old kitchen used to be before the kitchen expansion project happened, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Marge Brown was also an important member of the church. She chaired or participated on every committee at one time or another except buildings and grounds. She also ran the Couples Club in 1960 and was coffee mother from 1975 to 1983. She often organized elegant receptions for memorial services and other events. Our fireplace room was renamed the Marge Brown Room in her honor in 1985, soon after she passed away. On May 23, 1961, a joint General Assembly of the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association, a vote was made to consolidate and become a single denomination. At a congregational meeting in 1967, within a few months after moving our meeting house, the members of the First Universalist Church of Farmington voted to rename themselves the Universalist Unitarian Church of Farmington, putting Universalist as the first word in the 2 words, whereas most churches at the time were putting Unitarian in front. But the members chose to put Universalist in front since our church had a rich history as a Universalist church. Soon after the big move, the church began seeking ways to put to use the open expanse that surrounded it. One of the most exciting projects to occur on the new property was called Andiamo. Longtime church member Norma Cole, with the help of Pat Morrow and others, organized this interracial summer day camp partly as a response to the 1967 race rebellions in Detroit and other American cities. Reverend Bob Eddy preached on the issue, and Norma Cole came up with the idea to bring the races together to learn to play and have fun on the inviting old farm acreage around the meeting house. Called Andiamo, meaning let's go in Italian, the camp brought together youngsters aged 4 to 12 of both African and European ancestry. The first Andiamo ran for 2 weeks, Monday through Friday in the summer of 1968. Church volunteers helped carpool campers and mothers from all over Detroit and the suburbs. Each day's activities were planned well in advance, but there was plenty of time left open to explore the woods, fields, apple orchards, and especially the old barn that still stood on the property, which proved fascinating to the children. See this woman here, Miss Pat. That's our own Pat Morrow. Reverend Joan Conch Snyder, a former businesswoman, was engaged by the church in the 1980s. In 1980. The search committee had realized it could not afford someone with a great deal of ministerial experience, and perhaps were wary of hiring yet another young person fresh out of seminary, so they instead sought an individual with a great deal of life experience. Joan had presently served several years owning and operating a bookstore in Cincinnati, raising 4 children and attending Union Theology Seminary. UUCF was her first pulpit. When Joan arrived, she remarked on a Sunday morning that she thought that perhaps, she was the church's first woman minister. It turns out that she wasn't. Then she thought, perhaps I'm your first Jewish minister. Again, this was not so. Perhaps she was our first minister from Cincinnati, she wondered. But no, I had already had a minister from Cincinnati. Well, in that case, she said, then I am your first female Jewish minister from Cincinnati. In the 1980s, a member of the church, Vince Beneteau, created many drawings of church life. He was a compulsive artist who always carried a sketch pad, pencils, charcoal, and pastels with him. He drew sketches of people in public places and then gave the pictures away to the subjects. Over the years, he donated many prints and oil paintings to our auctions. His ashes are interred in our memorial garden. And this person here with the hat is our own Gwen Voss from the back. In 1983, Reverend Joan preached a sermon called Homophobia. In 1984, it won the Skinner Award for Best Sermon on Social Justice preached by a UU. Joan took the prize money and purchased the stained glass window. The window was installed as an indoor wall hanging on the north wall of the meeting house, and during the building expansion in 1986, the wall was knocked down and an opening was constructed in the new wall just for the window, which we can still admire today. The burgeoning membership was straining the building to capacity, and a major expansion project was undertaken in 1984. $25,000 was given to the church from Francis F. Whiting, the father of Barb Windsor, and this became the seed money for a new capital fund drive. A plaque of Francis and his wife is hanging in the kitchen today. Eric Karn was the architect. Art Morrow followed the construction for 2 years. The new kitchen and enlarged meeting house were a larger platform to accommodate weddings. Equipment for the new kitchen were selected by Gordon Wilson and Pat Morrow. So here's some photographs of the expansion. This is where the sanctuary is, and our kitchen was moved from back where the storage closet is to the new location for the kitchen. After Joan Conch Snyder's departure, Reverend Kathleen Damwood Korb was installed as interim minister in 1985. She served only 7 months before she was called to serve a congregation in New Orleans, Louisiana. Following Reverend Katie, as she preferred to be called, was Reverend Walter Stamp Jonas, who was called in the latter part of 1987. He served for just 8 months before he was forced to leave because he proved to be an incredibly destructive element among members of the congregation as well as the staff. Reverend Suzanne Paul was called to UUCF in 1988. She was born in Hazel Park, Michigan in 1945, but moved to Farmington at the age of 5, where she attended the local Roman Catholic schools from grade 1 to 12. Her association with liberal religion started prior to 1971 when she married Charlie Paul, a member of the Birmingham Temple and Bloomfield, Michigan. This congregation of humanist Jews was founded by Rabbi Sherwin Wine, a radical atheist who believed that Jewish history, tradition, and modes of worship were worth preserving even though the notion of God had become outdated. In 1986, Suzanne became a certified humanist counselor, a title similar to minister granted by the American Humanist Association. At the time, she served a 10-month ministerial internship under Reverend Kenneth Pfeiffer at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ann Arbor from 1986 to 1987. Under Reverend Suzanne's direction, UUCF realized fantastic growth. Membership swelled to over 200 for the first time ever. During Suzanne's pastorate, we also celebrated our 150-year anniversary. As part of the plans for the celebration, a timeline was put together highlighting the special events of the 150 years, which I've duplicated here. The 150-year celebration was conducted in 1999 with a special dinner at the Botsford Inn on a Saturday night, and the next Sunday was a service, and the key speaker was UU World magazine editor Tom Stites. There was also a play performed, and everyone was given a pin to commemorate the event. So we're coming to current times. Prior to Reverend Alex's installation, we did have an interim minister, Reverend Robert Rengillian, who served for 1 year to help us with our search. And then that culminated in the search committee calling Reverend Alex Riegel as our 36th minister. And this is a list of all the ministers that have served the Farmington congregation over its 150 plus year history. So I'll just let you look at that list. And this concludes the presentation. I just want to say that in reading through Gwen's manuscript, there is a lot more information about the history of the church, and we will do what we can to get the book published. I took the events that I thought were most significant and decided to concentrate on those, but there's several other or lots of other intriguing information about the history of this church. Well, thank you for your time.